Hello, political geography class, and today I'm going to introduce you to the last part of this middle section of the module, which looks at policy making on the environment, or the politics of the environment, environmental politics. So really what I'm giving you is kind of a very brief, over these 3 weeks, very brief introduction to some themes or ideas in environmental politics. In terms of what to focus on, over the last few lectures, especially last week, but also the lecture 2 weeks ago, the first lecture in the series, the first one after the Halloween break, I've been introducing you to a number of different concepts which crop up again and again, and generally concepts that you can apply to case studies. I'll give you some case study examples in the lecture material, and today is basically going to be largely a case study. But watch out for these concepts. So there's concepts like non-decision making, insiders, outsiders, which was nearly the first 2 concepts I introduced to you way back, oh gosh, it feels like a month ago, but only 2 weeks ago now at this stage, when I was talking about the elitism model of power, or elitism model of power in politics. We've come across other concepts as well. We've looked at things like administrative fragmentation. We've talked about collective action problems. We've talked about other things as well. So there's been a good few concepts. And I'll be coming back to these again and again today now. So while I'm talking today, just keep an ear out for these concepts we've already covered, just to see how they can be applied to the climate change case study, or the story of Ireland's approach to climate change and climate change policy. Keep an ear out for those concepts. I'll try and signpost them a bit as I'm going through, but that's really what I want you to do in this module, is to understand the basic concepts. And I'm not going to throw a lot of very difficult concepts at you. Understand the difficult concepts and be able to apply them. So whether, as with, say, the geography of elections assignment, there's a few concepts we cover in the module. Analysing the data in the tally sheets, analysing the information you've been given in the assignment guidelines. Can you make sense of those concepts? Can you show how you understand those concepts? So answer the question, make use of the data, and explain your answer then based on what you picked up from the module, and hopefully based on a few insights you will hopefully have picked up from recommended readings. Anyway, key readings for today, again the same as for the last few weeks. This last group, the second group of recommended readings, these are readings with more of an Irish focus. So you might find some of these readings are more relevant today, particularly if you want to kind of understand what is happening with climate change policy, and why there's been certain points in time where it's been really hard to get a lot of movement in terms of climate change policy. Okay, so the last day we looked at 3 of the 4 barriers to effective environmental policy making, including things like the issue attention cycle, collective action problems, and also the complexity of environmental issues married with the limited scope of policymakers to actually address these complex environmental issues. At the start of today's lecture, today's group of 2 lectures, I'm going to talk about the last of these barriers, power and influence, or the power and influence of business groups. And this links back to what I was talking about way back 2 weeks ago, when I was talking about the elitism model. Back then I introduced the concept of insiders and outsiders, or insider groups and outsider groups. So why might businesses have so much power and influence over the environmental policymaking process? There's 2 reasons. Businesses themselves generally tend to be very well organized, and they know how to use their influence, and they know the different mechanisms they can use to increase that level of influence. One of the most useful mechanisms that they might employ is lobbying. Now, 2 weeks ago, I was talking about environmental groups. I said basically there's a choice for environmental groups in terms of what political approach or political action they might try to take. They can go down the route of direct action and protest, or they can use more conventional means of trying to affect political change, such as lobbying. And lobbying is a quiet form of political action, but it's generally an effective form of political action because you actually get to sit with the policymakers. And it's not a case of you're trying to bamboozle them. It's not a case that you're trying to kind of do dirty deals behind closed doors. A lot of times it's a conversation. And generally, if you're a good lobbyist, you're going to try and see, okay, what does the government want? What do I want? How can we meet in the middle? Sometimes lobbying might be just simply the government saying we need this, and the lobbyists or the lobbying group saying we can provide you with this. Lobbying sometimes can involve groups such as business groups trying to influence policymakers about an upcoming policy decision, or trying to influence them not to take that policy decision, as I'll mention later on. Business groups can also fund pressure groups to kind of push forward a certain agenda, but they'll also use publicity. Publicity can come in different forms. They can buy advertisements in newspapers to try and push a certain agenda, or sometimes because they've such influence, they'll write letters to newspapers, but sometimes they'll be allowed to write an opinion piece for newspapers, because if you're the head of the main business lobby group in Ireland, IBEC, if you tell the Irish Independent you want to write an opinion piece for them, they'll take that opinion piece. You do have a lot of clout, not just politically, but also economically and within media circles. The other element, of course, is when businesses are doing well, when businesses are employing a lot of people, that's obviously good for the economy. That's obviously good in terms of keeping unemployment levels down. And when the economy is doing well and when unemployment levels are low, generally governments have a much better chance of being returned back to power. So a strong economy means governments have a much better chance of being returned to power. Say, take the last general election in Ireland, now almost a year ago. The two main parties in that government, not the smallest party, but the two main parties generally were both returned back to power and actually picked up a few extra seats. It was a good election for them. And why was that? Because the economy was doing well. By and large, that was the main reason. The other concept to remind yourself of here, again, it goes back to the elitist model or elitism model I talked about 2 weeks ago, non-decision making. So this refers to how issues get pushed onto the political agenda or off the political agenda. And in this case, we're looking at how the business actions of business groups or business lobby groups can play a role here. So non-decision making, I talked about 2 weeks ago. This is how, if there's an upcoming policy decision or policy issue to be discussed, if there's a big issue where the public wants action on that issue, a big issue or problem, the public wants action, but that action might have damaging effects for certain businesses and potentially damaging effects for the economy. The government might decide the best thing to do in that case is to play for time, to not take a decision. So hence the term non-decision making. So there's certain mechanisms that can be used. You can say we need more research on this topic, or if it's another issue, we need a tribunal of inquiry to work out what happened here. We need to do something before we can take a decision. So we might need more information, and that takes a while. But in actually putting those wheels in motion, there's a general sense amongst the public, okay, the government's taking this seriously, they're going to do something. The business lobby, which might have pushed for the government to more or less use these non-decision tactics, is behind the scenes giving the thumbs up. They're happy with what happens, because what's going to happen? At the point in time, that environmental issue or that environmental problem is probably a hot issue. It's at the top of the media's attention. The public are worried about it. Now, any research gathering or any tribunal is going to take a long time. We'll just say, in a very moderate timescale, maybe that work is finished after 2 years. 2 years down the line, if we remember back to the issue attention cycle, at that stage, maybe people aren't that pushed or that worried about this problem to the same extent as they were 2 years ago. What actually comes out of this tribunal, or what comes out of this research gathering process? Probably an 813-page report produced by boffins that most of the public don't fully understand, that most people, including the policymakers themselves, aren't going to read the whole report. And it's just produced and said, okay, there's it, and maybe nothing's going to happen after that. Maybe the one thing that the report will do is they'll give ideas to the government or policymakers on action that they could take if this issue comes back again to the top of the political agenda in a few years' time, as you would expect based on the issue attention cycle. So as with the focus on the concepts of insider groups and outsider groups, this idea of power and influence highlights the fact that there's disparities in terms of access to policymakers and influence over policymakers between powerful, influential insider groups, most notably the business lobby groups such as IBEC in Ireland, and maybe other groups like, say, the Farmers Lobby Group, and outsider groups, maybe student groups, unemployed groups, etc., etc. You tend to get these disparities also being more evident, and the effect of these disparities becoming more evident in that most countries will operate out of what's called the traditional policy paradigm. So different elements of this we mentioned already. First of all, the idea of administrative fragmentation, the idea that a lot of times there's very little policy coordination between different government departments. So generally government departments see themselves as separate kingdoms. They see their department as being the body that should be solely focused on issues to do with, say, enterprise, in the case of the Department of Enterprise, taxation, as with the Department of Finance, agricultural issues, as with the Department of Agriculture, and they resent any attempt by other departments to what they might see as acts of interference in the business of their own department. The problem is, for environmental issues, you actually need buy-in from different government departments in order for effective policies to be developed, as we'll discuss today. The other dimension is the idea of the implementation deficit gap. So the idea that it's hard enough to develop a policy, and trust me, it's very hard to develop effective environmental policies, but it's also even harder to put that policy into practice. Because if we look at the case of Ireland, a lot of the responsibility for implementation often falls into the hands of local authorities. Local authorities which are generally don't have the personnel to do this work effectively, and they don't have the funding to do this work effectively. So you often find this implementation deficit gap occurring even when you might have finally finished the process, even when you might have finally finished the process of drawing up what you think is an effective policy on a specific environmental issue or environmental problem. So administrative fragmentation again ensures there's disproportionate access to the policy process because of the way that the state's government is divided up, its institutional structure. Because you've got this breaking up of government into different departments. As I said before, there's one knock-on effect of that, little policy coordination between the different departments if they get very kind of closed in and very focused on protecting their own territory. Another dimension of this is that when you become the minister of a certain department or the head of a certain department, you see yourself as representing all interests relating to that department. So when you become the Minister for Enterprise, you see yourself as the spokesperson for business interests when it comes to cabinet discussions. So you almost, like overnight, you'll see yourself as an advocate for the interests of business interests. As such, you're going to be very much focused on hearing the views of business interests. In a similar vein, the Minister for Agriculture will see themselves as the champion or the cheerleader for the interests of farmers' groups. And as such, then, you have this element being brought into cabinet discussions, that you have 1 or 2 or 3 ministers who will be pushing the views of insider groups, business interests or farmers' interests or other interests and so on. The interests of, say, electricity companies, Minister for Energy. Okay, so we're going to look today at a case study, mainly a case study, and the case study is Ireland's climate change policy between the 1990s and the present day. So it's a very quick gloss over different aspects or different stories or different events in this. It's not the entire picture. And this might be something, if you move on into 3rd year or you move on into masters, this might be an interesting topic to look at in more detail in terms of a potential thesis topic. Okay, climate change as a political issue, it probably can be dated back to the late 1980s, early 1980s. There was knowledge about the science of climate change going back decades before that, but as an issue that finally gripped the attention of the public and finally gripped the attention of politicians, you can probably date we probably can date the point in time where climate change as an issue for the first time hit stage 2 of the issue attention cycle. You're probably looking at the late 1980s. I remember when I was a first year student in Maynooth University in 1989, to be honest, back then we were focused on global environmental issues, but back in the late 1980s, we were aware of climate change, but in the late 1980s, the ozone hole or ozone depletion was looked on as the big environmental issue. Climate change starts to become, you start to get a lot more focus on climate change as a political issue, especially at a global level, especially in the early 1990s. In the lead up to what became known as the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. Now, the Irish government in the early 1990s, remember, as I said before 2 weeks ago, the Irish economy had gone through a prolonged period of recession from the mid-1970s right up until probably the late 1980s, maybe even the early 1990s. The Irish government in the early 1990s, Ireland was still coming out of this kind of decade and a half or almost 2 decades of a recession. And to be honest, not that many people, I would suggest, in the Irish government not too many were aware of climate change as an issue as well. They knew about the Earth Summit coming up. They hoped to get a nice jolly to Rio de Janeiro to take part in the Earth Summit. But by and large, the Minister for Environment at the time, I think it was Pádraig Flynn, definitely in the late 1980s, it wasn't seen as a big issue. It was seen as something that, maybe the European Union's going to decide an approach on, and we'll just follow in that approach. So there was a lot of nice words maybe said about climate change. We're very worried about this. I think something should be done. But the Irish approach to climate change in the early to mid-1990s was generally aspirational. And basically the Irish government's approach was, this is probably a topic that's best dealt with at a transnational level. And we think it's probably in terms of our involvement or our engagement with the issue of climate change, we think the best way to do this is as a member state of the European Union. So we think the European Union as a whole should take the lead in this, and we'll try to follow that lead. But remember, we're still an underdeveloped economy with respect to the rest of the European Union. We really need to be able to develop our economy, so hopefully any actions the European Union takes on this won't affect our ability to develop the Irish economy. Now, the Rio Earth Summit was really the first major conference where you saw climate change being discussed as a political issue by different governments. And the European Union definitely was one of the more proactive members or proactive actors in this discussion. In the wake of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, as part of its negotiation strategy, the European Union said it would try to stabilize its greenhouse gas levels across the European Union to 1990 levels by the year 2000. The Irish government was, as part of this, said, yeah, we agree, great idea. We think Europe should do this, but we don't think we should do this. We don't think we should be expected to do this because we are an underdeveloped economy. We've gone through this long period of recession. Living standards in Ireland are, and we're talking here about the early 1990s, living standards in Ireland fall way below living standards in more prosperous European countries like Great Britain or Germany or France or Sweden or Austria. So the Irish government's communication to the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, UNFCCC, basically said, look, we like this as an idea. We think this is a good thing that Europe's trying to do, and we'll try to help, but we are not in a position to stabilize our greenhouse gas levels back to 1990 levels by the year 2000, because we are looking ahead, hopefully, to a period of economic growth. And we don't want to have to sign up to greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that will limit our ability to drive this process of economic growth. And in the 1990s, Europe looked at Ireland and said, you know what, Ireland, and you know what, Italy, and you know what, Spain, and you know what, Portugal, and you know what, Greece. We see where you're coming from. We understand you need this ability and the scope to develop your economy. So in the early 90s, as one of what was viewed as the developing states within the European Union, including Ireland, Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Italy, these 5 states, or maybe even just Ireland, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, there was a general sense amongst the European Union that there should be some degree of leeway or latitude offered to these developing states. Now, in 1997, there was a big climate conference in Kyoto in Japan where, and this is important because this is the only time this has ever happened. At Kyoto, all the different states across the world sat down and they thrashed out an agreement on taking action on climate change. And what this became known, it was effectively a treaty, it becomes known as Kyoto Protocol. This Kyoto Protocol was basically designed as what was meant to be the first steps being taken by governments across the world in terms of starting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea of the Kyoto Protocol was that the first step should be taken by the most developed countries or the most developed regions around the globe. Western Europe, North America, Australia. So this was basically meant to be an act of good faith to the rest of the world, the developing world, to say, look, we're aware, we all know we need to take action on this issue because we don't, things are going to get very bad very quickly. But we're aware that most of the damage, environmental damage, has probably been caused by industrialization in the developed world. So it makes sense for the states in the developed world to take the lead on taking action on climate change. So it was decided that the European Union as a whole would agree to reduce its emissions, start the process of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, including greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, and the USA decided it would also start the process of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. The European Union came into the Kyoto conference, or the Kyoto process, with a more ambitious set of targets. But once they realized other developed countries such as the United States weren't going to be as proactive, they reduced their initial targets down to 8%. So the idea was, by signing up to Kyoto, the European Union promise said across the entire European Union, we will, as a group of was then, I think, 16 states, we will aim to reduce our emissions, total emissions across the European Union by 8% relative to the levels in 1990 by the year 2010. So again, this was not seen as going to be the be-all and end-all of solving climate change. This was just seen as a first step. And the idea then was that more ambitious targets would be signed up to at kind of the successor to Kyoto. So Kyoto effectively, the Kyoto Protocol would run its course in 2010, and the idea would be that in 2008 or 2009, you'd have a similar agreement or similar treaty being signed up to at a conference that would carry on this process that had been started with Kyoto. Now, what is interesting about Kyoto, there was no protocol actually signed up to or in 2008, 2009, but the Kyoto Protocol is an example of an international legally binding emissions treaty. And by signing up to Kyoto as a member of the European Union, Ireland was accepting this principle that there would be legally binding emissions limits. There would be legally binding emissions targets that it would have to achieve by the year 2010. And if it didn't achieve those targets, there would be penalties, fines. Now, within the European Union, as I said already, as you see there in the slides, the aim across the European Union was we will try to reduce our overall emissions by 8% relative to the levels we were at in 1990 by the year 2010. But the European Union decided, look, we're a group of 16 different states. Some states are economically advanced. Some states are some states have lower living standards. Some states are developing economies. So the European Union said, look, what are we going to do here? What we're going to do is we're going to do effectively what happened at Kyoto itself. We're going to create a scenario where the most developed states in the European Union will take on even more ambitious targets than this 8% target. And this will allow the developing states to still increase emission levels, but only up to a certain point. So they said, look, Ireland, we know you're going through a process of economic growth, of economic development. We'll allow you to increase your emissions. Countries like Germany and the United Kingdom and Austria will take on even higher emission reduction targets to allow this. So we'll allow you to still increase your emissions up to a certain point, but we don't want you going over this. So Ireland was given a 13% target. So basically what Ireland was signing up to as part of what becomes known as the European Burden Sharing Agreement, Ireland was basically saying, look, we know we're growing our economy. And the knock-on effect of this is emission levels are going to increase over the next few years. We will try to limit the level of this increase to 13%, and we'll try and hit that target by the year 2010. So yeah, that was the basic. So Kyoto, European Union as a bloc of 16 countries, later on becomes 28 countries and then 27 when the United Kingdom leaves. The European Union as a bloc agreed collectively greenhouse gas emissions across the European Union would be reduced by 8% by 2010 relative to the levels that these relative to the emission levels in 1990. But we had this European burden sharing agreement. So developing countries within the European Union, including Ireland, were going to be allowed to still increase their greenhouse gas emissions, but only up to a certain point. So the target for Ireland was you're allowed to increase your emissions, but only up to 13% above 1990 levels. And you need to hit this target by 2010, otherwise there will be penalties, there will be fines. Other countries like Germany agreed, and as a matter of good faith, agreed to reduce their emissions by even higher targets. So Germany signed up to reduce its emissions by 21%. Okay, so Ireland was now part of this legally binding agreement on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and Ireland would need to do something. Because it was very evident, even by 1997, 1998, it's very evident if the Irish government didn't take any action, that this 13% target Ireland would exceed this 13% target by quite a distance. So the Irish government realised, okay, we need to do something. But the big problem here was deciding what that something was going to be. And the other big problem was the amount of time it took to decide what this something would be. So the Economic, Social and Research Institute said, look, they did research and they said, look, the best way of doing this is we should bring in a carbon tax, increase energy charges. So we'll bring in the carbon tax, which will add extra money and extra costs onto the price of fuel for heating or for transport. They said, okay, because if you do that, remember what I said last week about green taxes. If you increase the cost of fuel, it's going to be a disincentive. People won't be just burning oil for the sake of it. They'll be a lot more thoughtful about heating their homes. They might put on an extra jumper or two rather than turn on the heating at certain times of the year. And they also said knock-on effect on transport. If you add on an extra 20 cents under the cost of petrol or diesel, then people might think twice about using the car. So you might say, okay, I could just pop into the car and go down to the shops, or I could have a nice 20-minute walk up to the shops and back and save myself using the car and save myself the cost of the extra petrol. So that's the big idea of the carbon tax and other green taxes. They're meant to be a disincentive to encourage people to make less use of their cars or to put on their heating less. Road pricing, so that's the idea of having tolls and roads, and increased investment in public transport. So this was the Economic, Social and Research Institute's advice. They said this is the way you're going to hit this 13% target, by bringing in these measures. Literally, the Kyoto Protocol, the ink on it was barely dry, and you start to see domestic opposition emerging within Ireland against the idea of bringing in the carbon tax. So you start to see the first evidence of domestic opposition mobilising against the proposal to bring in the carbon tax in the early 1998. As I said, literally months after the protocol itself was decided on. The business lobby, IBEC, was the most active opponent to the idea of bringing in a carbon tax. They basically said, look, this carbon tax is going to mean added costs for businesses, and it's meaning added costs at a point in time where businesses are now starting to coming out of this deep economic funk, they're coming out of this deep recession, and now they're trying to compete on the European market. But they said, look, we're proposing a carbon tax here. We don't see carbon taxes being proposed in other European countries. So why are we adding this extra cost on Irish businesses? How are we meant to compete with other European countries or with the United States of America or with other parts of the world if we've got this carbon tax, this extra cost to factor in as part of the process? So the IBEC, the business lobby, became very proactive in terms of opposing the carbon tax, and they proved themselves to be a very effective and very organised lobbying group. By contrast, the environmental groups were pretty poor in terms of supporting the carbon tax. They weren't particularly vocal, They proved themselves to be a very weak sector which lacked a sense of cohesion. Now, there was opposition within cabinet. The main people opposing the idea of a carbon tax was the Minister for Enterprise, Mary Harney, and the Minister for Finance at the time, Charlie McCreevy. Now, Mary Harney is interesting. I think this sort of highlights the fact that when you're a minister in the government, you very quickly take on the issues of the department you move into. So Mary Harney, we mentioned her in the last lecture. We talked about how she was a very important person, a very important actor in terms of resolving the smog issues in Dublin. At that point in time, she was a junior minister in the Department of Environment. You move forward 8-9 years later, and 1997, she goes into government as the leader of the Progressive Democrats with Fianna Fáil, and she becomes the Minister for Enterprise. And now she's acting on behalf of business interests. And at Cabinet, she saw her responsibility as to push forward the interests of the business groups at Cabinet discussions. So reflecting the business, the approach and the arguments put forward by the business lobby, Mary Harney generally reflected those views at the Cabinet table. Well, why was the Minister for Finance so opposed to the idea of a carbon tax? Basically, it was a sense that he was saying, okay, I'm the Minister for Finance, and again, you might remember I've said this already, in terms of how governments operate, you have the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, or Taoiseach and Taoiseach in Ireland. After those people, the next most important member of the government, and sometimes possibly even the most influential member of the government, can be the Minister for Finance, because they're the person who decides on how much funding goes to different departments, and also they basically decide how the money is spent within government. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, like ministers for finance like Pascal Donoghue, they do have a lot of clout. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Charlie McCreevy had a massive level of clout within the government. He was strongly supported by Mary Harney, and the Taoiseach of the time, Bertie Ahern, was basically like, okay, I'm putting Charlie McCreevy in charges, I'll let him at it, whatever he says goes. So Charlie McCreevy was probably one of the most powerful ever ministers for finance that we've seen in Ireland in the last few decades. So the general sense within the government was the idea of a carbon tax it wasn't a case, they weren't looking on this as something we need to do to achieve our legally binding requirements under the Kyoto Protocol. Within government, there was a sense that this carbon tax proposal was the Minister for Environment, who was Noel Dempsey at the time, trying to push the interests of his department and trying to invade the territory normally associated with other departments, such as enterprise, agriculture, but also finance. Charlie McCreevy was saying, look, I'm the Minister for Finance. What the F? What are you doing suggesting taxation policy to me? That's my job. You're only the bloody Minister. You're only the bloody Minister of Environment. You're way down the pecking order. Get lost. So that was the general sense within the government. So you start to see the impacts of administrative fragmentation, but you can also see the influence of lobby groups there. So the Minister of Enterprise very quickly becomes the spokesperson of the business lobby. The Minister for Agriculture very quickly becomes the spokesperson of the farming lobby. And we've seen this again and again. Oftentimes, these can be people who, in previous government jobs, on previous government posts, were very pro-environment. But they move to a different department and very quickly take on the interests of that particular department, and they see themselves as the voice of the particular interest groups linked to that department. So what was the response? Think classic non-decision making. You buy for time. So rather than the government doing probably what they really needed to do in 1998 and say, look, guys, come on. Look, our economy is starting to go into overdrive here. We're now moving into the Celtic Tiger period. We're looking at rapid levels of economic growth. There's no way we're going to hit that 13% target in 2010 unless we take action. And we probably need to grasp the nettle here and now and bring in this carbon tax. And this is probably not a bad time to do it because the economy is doing well and probably people can absorb this extra charge a bit more easier than would be the case if we're in a recession. But the decision was we'll delay taking action. So it was sidelined to what became known as the social partnership discussions. Now, the social partnership discussions were, this was the brainwave of the then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, the social partnership, because he saw in previous governments, he said, well, what happens when we try to do something about improving the economy or helping the economy? A lot of times it's undermined because certain trade union groups may pull the rug from under the government's feet, there's strikes, and you end up having to make different decisions or different agreements with different sectors of society. So the social partnership was basically, it was a measure brought in by Bertie Ahern to try and get consensus between the most significant groups within Irish society at the time, the business lobby, the trade unions, the farmers' lobby, on key policy issues and get an agreement, get them to buy into this. So in 1998, Charlie McCreevy said, look, let's move this discussion to the social partnership discussions. Which the social partnership, as is suggested here, it was basically a means used by Bertie Ahern to try and get a consensus on different hot potatoes, different difficult decisions that the Irish government would have to take. Now, as time went on, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the Irish economy went into overdrive, it was a lot easier to get consensus because the government didn't have to take hard decisions because there was a lot of money flowing into the economy. Opposition parties basically saw this decision as the government more or less outsourcing a decision on the carbon tax to this outside group which included key lobby groups, the business lobby, the farmers lobby, the trade unions, and a body that had certain interests getting a lot more say within it. So the social partnership included certain elements of Irish society. It didn't include all elements. Opposition main cabinet. What was the opposition main cabinet? I mentioned Mary Harney already. The concerns was about, and her concerns reflected the concerns of the business lobby. Her concerns reflected the concerns of IBEC. Basically, the big concern there was the impact on the competitiveness of Irish enterprises. Basically saying, look, we add on this, we bring in this carbon tax, it's an added cost for Irish businesses, and they're going to be at a disadvantage, a comparative disadvantage, when they're trying to build up a market across Europe or in other parts of the world, when they're taking on firms from other countries where you don't have this carbon tax. And they suggested maybe we should go down the route of emissions trading instead. The idea of emissions trading, again, remember back to what I mentioned last week about the different economic mechanisms you can use. This idea of emissions trading, the idea being put forward there, okay, if we're over our 13% target, we can buy permits or we can buy quotas from other countries who have exceeded their targets, who have done much better than the targets that they set out to achieve. And this was part of the European Burden Sharing Agreement. Now, the European Burden Sharing Agreement said nothing about countries having to bring in, all the European Union countries having to bring in a carbon tax, because at that point in time, and still today, taxation was seen as part of national competence. The European Union always felt that, look, decisions on taxation, we might offer advice on it, but ultimately decisions on taxation should be taken by national governments, and the European Union shouldn't be imposing its will in relation to taxation on national governments. Energy's concern was, look, you bring in carbon tax, it's going to increase energy prices. And it's really not going to have any effect in terms of reducing emissions in any case, because we'll still have to produce electricity. We'll still need to turn on the light. We'll still need to heat our homes. So what's the point? The Minister for Social Affairs was concerned. Now, they weren't saying don't bring in a carbon tax, but they said, look, a carbon tax is going to have a greater influence, all in all, on poor people, the poorer sections of Irish society. So they said, look, if you're bringing in a carbon tax, you'll need to bring in measures to reduce the impact of that carbon tax on the poor members of Irish society. Agriculture's concern was about the impacts of the carbon tax on farmers. And as I'll show you later on, this was particularly, agriculture gets a lot of focus over the next few decades because when you look at the proportion of emissions that come from different sectors, agriculture comes out pretty high in relation to that. And we mentioned already, Charlie McCreevy was not sold on the idea of a carbon tax. And this proved to be a big block in terms of taking action in the late 1990s and early 2000s because Charlie McCreevy was such an influential Minister for Finance. Okay, time goes on, you move into the 1990s, early 2000s, and there's still no action, no decision taken by the Irish government on what action is going to take to try and reduce the level of emission growth in the Irish economy. Now, again, to remind you, Ireland was still being allowed to increase its emissions, but the general expectation was that Ireland would only increase its emission levels by 13% relative to the levels it stood at in 1990 by the year 2010. In the 2002 budget, and there was an expectation that finally the 2002 budget was just after the general election. There won't be another general election for another 5 years. The general expectation was this would be the budget where you might see a carbon tax being brought in. Because if you're a government, if you want to bring in unpopular decisions, the best time to do so is in the first year of being after you're elected into power. Because if you want to bring in the nice decisions, the nice policies, if you want to hand out a few extra bob to people, the best time to do that is in the last 2 years that you're going to be in government for, just before the election. So the expectation was the 2002 budget is the ideal time to bring in this carbon tax. But instead, Charlie McCreevy says, okay, we're going to have a carbon tax, but it will come in at the 2004 budget instead of the 2002 budget. Most people feel this was really McCreevy. If he had been mindful to bring in the carbon tax, he'd missed a big opportunity here. As I said before, the best time to bring in an unpopular decision or a new tax is always at the start, in the first year of a government's time in power, because you have another 4 years to try and win over the public if they don't like that decision. The political conditions at that point in time were also generally favourable to bringing in the carbon tax. Oil prices had gone down, so the impact of the carbon tax wouldn't be felt as badly as it would have been at other points in time where oil prices were higher. There was also a mini recession in 2002, and the government did need to increase its revenue. So the carbon tax could have been a useful means of the government raising its revenue and basically saying, look, this is why we're doing it. It's not our decision. We're doing this because the European Union wants us to start taking action on limiting our greenhouse gas emissions levels growth. But before this 2004 budget, Charlie McCreevy said, look, we'll have one final public consultation on the carbon tax proposals before we make a final decision. Again, think of classic non-decision making techniques. More research, sideline the issue to the social partnership, or say we need consultation, we need a public consultation. If you ever want to delay something, guys, if you go into government, and I'm sure maybe one or two of you will eventually go into government at some stage, if you want to delay an action, just say we need a public consultation. So in June 2003, it was decided we need one final public consultation on the carbon tax proposal. Now, what did the public consultations tell people? It basically told people more or less what you knew already. The business lobby, the farmers lobby, so IBEC, the main association of businesses, the main lobbying group on behalf of businesses, and the Irish Farmers Association, the farmers lobby, both came out very strongly against the carbon tax proposal. Irish Farmers Association said they were fundamentally opposed to the proposal. The community and voluntary sector kind of came out and said, okay, we're not against the idea, we see the importance of the idea, but if you're going to bring in this tax, you need to bring in measures that will offset the impact of this tax on poorer people. Generally, most of the significant social partners, the business lobby, the farmers lobby, even trade union groups, came out with submissions that opposed the carbon tax proposal. The environmental groups, or the environmental non-governmental organizations, by contrast, really didn't get their act together. They were pretty bad in terms of their approach to this public consultation. Their submissions were kind of poor, they were limited, and the lack of coordination between them, it basically kind of was in stark contrast to the well-organised vocal opposition that was being offered by the business lobby and the farmers lobby. 2004 then, the general, as I said, the expectation was that the carbon tax would come in at the 2004 budget, which would be October or November 2004. In 2004, it was decided that Charlie McCreevy would leave his post as Minister for Finance, and he would move to become the EU Commission, Ireland's EU Commissioner. Almost like the last thing he did before he left government, Charlie McCreevy decided, look, there's going to be no carbon tax, guys. He said, after this extensive public consultation, we've decided that a carbon tax is not an appropriate policy option. Instead, we will intensify action on non-tax measures. Now, what these non-tax measures were going to be was still very much open for discussion, very much open for debate. Now, remember, this is 2004. This is 7 years after Kyoto. The target, the year that Ireland was aiming for, was 2010. So there was only 6 years left until 2010. And kind of well over halfway through this period between Kyoto and 2010, well over halfway during this period, the Irish government was still scrambling around for action. It spent about 7 years debating on whether to bring in the carbon tax. Eventually, 7 years later, Charlie McCreevy says, no, there's going to be no carbon tax, we'll use non-tax measures instead. One of the ideas put forward was that Ireland could engage in the emissions trading, so maybe buy greenhouse gas emissions permits of other countries that are doing much better on their emission reduction targets than Ireland was. And that was part of EU law. As I said before, decisions on any form of taxation in the mindset of the European Union, these were decisions that could only be taken by national governments. Now, since the economic recession of 2008, 2009, the European Union has become a bit more proactive on government's financial policies, government's taxation policies. But back then, taxation, any form of taxation, was seen as a matter of national competence. Basically, that means this taxation was something that could only be decided on by national governments. Now, 5 years later, and I'll mention why, the carbon tax is eventually introduced in Ireland at the 2009 budget. What is happening in terms of emission levels in Ireland, however? Emission levels were going through the roof. So remember, the target for Ireland had been set as part of the Kyoto Protocol and the EU burden sharing agreement in relation to that Kyoto Protocol. The target for Ireland was you can increase your emissions, but only up to 13% above the level that you stood in 1990 and you need to hit that target by 2010, otherwise there will be financial penalties. The problem was, for Ireland was a victim at that point in time of its own economic success. There was this expectation that Ireland would go through a process of economic growth in the 1990s and 2000s, but the level of growth far exceeded expectations. And the response to economic growth didn't help matters either, because Ireland's housing policy and transport policy had the knock-on effects of increasing the level of dependence people had on their cars. So the general decision was, okay, the knock-on effects of economic growth was there a lot more housing was required. A lot of this housing wasn't built in the Greater Dublin area. There was obviously a lot of housing built in the Greater Dublin area, but in some cases, the housing was built in towns 20 miles away, 30 miles away, 40 miles away, maybe even 50 miles away from Dublin. So a lot of the housing growth for people who were going to Dublin to work, or the Greater Dublin area to work, a lot of the housing for these workers was, a significant chunk of this housing was actually built in commuter towns, maybe 50 miles away from Dublin, maybe even 60 or 70 miles away from Dublin. Now, because of the motorway developments, the developments with new motorways, which had been largely funded by the European Union, because of these developments, this was actually possible. You could now get into a car on a good day. You could be, say, leave a town like Portlaoise or Tullamore or Drogheda, and if you left early, if you avoided heavy traffic, you could be nearly in Dublin within an hour. So it was now made a lot more sense to drive your car to work, because travel times had been significantly reduced because of the development of the new motorways. Back in the bad old days of the 1970s and 1980s, if you wanted to drive from Portlaoise to Dublin, it might take you a few hours because you were hitting traffic bottlenecks in towns like Monasterevin, Kildare, Newbridge, Naas, etc., etc. The knock-on effect of this was there was a lot more cars on the road. And with a lot more cars on the road, there's going to be a lot more pollution from motor vehicles. So the big spike in emission levels during the Celtic Tiger period came from transport. And we'll see some figures on that in a few slides' time. In 2004, the European Environment Agency produced its report, kind of a midway report, on how Europe was doing in terms of achieving its Kyoto Protocol targets. It noted that a number of member states were heading towards missing their burden sharing targets with domestic policies and measures, and Ireland was included amongst those. And one of the main issues was transport emissions. As the European Environment Agency said, look, if Ireland doesn't take corrective measures, the level of emissions coming from transport alone will increase by 180% between 1990 and 2010. So that's how things stood. In the mid-2000s, Ireland's emission levels were probably around 23, 24, 25% above the levels that they had stood at in 1990. So obviously, if things stayed at those levels, Ireland was going to come in way above its 13% burden sharing agreement, and there would be significant penalties for the Irish government. Now, think back to the issue attention cycle. In the early 1990s, with the Earth Summit, there was a lot of focus on climate change. The public were calling for action on climate change. The politicians were bought into the idea that there was going to be action on climate change. The Rio Earth Summit, gave a lot of motivation to politicians and the general public that action would be taken on the environment, action would be taken on climate change. A few years later, climate change had dropped off the public agenda. It wasn't seen as big an issue. A number of economies around the world, in the USA, in Europe, in the early 1990s, a lot of European economies and the USA's economy went into a bit of a recession in the early 1990s, and people weren't as invested in climate change as an issue as a result. Ireland was the exception. Ireland was one country. Was when a lot of the other European economies were in recession, the Irish economy was going. I was basically the level of economic growth was almost reaching crazy levels. Ireland was viewed as the Celtic tiger, like the economic tigers in South Asia. By the time of the mid 2000s, however, once again, climate change starts to move its way back up the political agenda. And in the years 2006, 2007, you start to see people, especially including people in Ireland, become a lot more invested in the need to take action on climate change. Now, in Ireland in the mid 2000s, because people were doing well, they had now more time and more scope to take account of quality of life issues such as environmental issues. So the economic conditions in Ireland probably helped to a large degree. But I'm old enough, I don't think any of you are old enough to remember the 2007 general election campaign. I'm old enough to remember that. In the lead up to this election, there was a sense that the Green Party was going to get a big upsurge in support, to win a lot more seats. All the other political parties were trying to get on the climate change bandwagon. I remember election leaflets coming from an election leaflet from my local Fianna Fáil TD. On the front page of it had penguins standing on an iceberg. Basically, almost all the leaflet was about, oh, we think climate change is a very serious issue. If we go into government, we're going to do something about that. I think, like, obviously, the general growing interest amongst the public on climate change was having a knock-on effect on all political parties. But I also think that Fianna Fáil as a political party at that point in time, they were already starting to jockey into position ahead of what they expected after the general election, that they might have to form, they expected to be forming a new government, but they might need to find a new coalition partner to form that new government with. And they were looking, saying, maybe our coalition partner for the last 10 years, the Progressive Democrats, maybe we won't have enough seats next time around to go into coalition with them again. Maybe we need a new coalition partner. And looking at the numbers, the ideal coalition partner would be a party that would have about 6, 7, or 8 seats, who would give you enough, who would make up the numbers to allow you to go into government, but would be small enough that they wouldn't totally, that basically it would be still a Fianna Fáil-led government. Now, the funny thing is, as you start to move closer to the general election, in January, February of 2007, even March 2007, climate change was probably looked on as one of the big election issues in the lead up to that 2007 general election. By the time you moved closer to the general election, climate change started to drop a bit down the agenda, and people started once again starting to get a bit more worried about the economy. So economic issues ultimately started to become more influential as you got closer to the election. And that had a knock-on effect on the Greens. The Greens came into that general election with 6 seats in Dáil Éireann, probably expecting that they could win 10 seats on a fairly good day, maybe even 12 or 13 or 14 on a very good day. But because the economy started to overtake environmental issues such as climate change as a main focus for people during that election, and there was a lot of different shenanigans going on as well in that election campaign about certain issues associated with Bertie Ahern himself. There were a lot of other things distracting the public. So the big focus on climate change that had been seen in 2006, in early 2007, that big focus did drop quite a bit in the actual final weeks leading up to that general election. And the Greens came into the election with 6 seats, and they came out of that general election with 6 seats. They gained a seat in Carlow Kilkenny, but they lost a seat in Cork South Central. Now, what's interesting to note, in not in the immediate lead up to the election, not in that kind of that last few weeks, the actual general election campaign itself, but in the kind of the months leading up to that general election, there had been a general sense that politicians did seem that they were going to be taking climate change more seriously. And at that point in time, in the year 2007, the most important politicians of all were Fianna Fáil politicians, because we, at that point in time, you might remember I talked about this in the geography of election section. In the mid 2000s, if you were looking at Irish politics in the mid 2000s, the general sense at that point in time was Fianna Fáil were likely to be in government for a long time. Now, who they went into government with, that might change, but the general sense was Fianna Fáil are doing well. Fianna Fáil will always win roughly 40% of the vote. They're unlikely not to lose a big number of votes, even if they fall to 37% of the vote. In any case, it doesn't matter. Fianna Fáil are likely to be in government the whole time. The only big question really is who they go into government with, who's going to be the junior coalition partners. So Fianna Fáil spoke a lot about the environment in the lead up to the 2007 general election. The big speech from Bertie Ahern at the Fianna Fáil Ardèche, the annual gathering of members of Fianna Fáil in March 2007, the big speech by Bertie Ahern at that Ardèche, a large part of his speech was focused on climate change. He talked about it, basically saying there's no greater challenge for our country and the world than the challenge of climate change. On the other hand, Bertie Ahern said, we reject the idea that we must reduce economic growth to meet our responsibilities on carbon emissions and indeed on climate change. So there's kind of different, he was speaking on the one hand that action was going to be taken, on the other hand he's saying, well, if action is going to be taken, we're not going to be setting about doing anything that's going to impact on the Irish economy. Now, what happens between 2007 and 2010? When the new Fianna Fáil Green Party government goes into power in June 2007, at that point in time, emission levels were probably about 21, 22, 23% above 1990 levels. So Ireland, it looked as if Ireland was going to come in way above its EU burden sharing agreement target once you hit 2010. And the general sense was there's going to be probably some financial penalties for Ireland. The Green Party wanted action to be taken on the environment, obviously. As the Green Party leader at the time, John Gormley, said, that's the reason we're going into government. We're going into government because we want things to be done. We want to do something on climate change. We want action on climate change. And over the next few years, actually, Ireland's emission levels declined rapidly, particularly from 2008 onwards. Now, what was the main cause of this? Was it government policy? No, the main cause of this was the fact that Ireland entered a major recession from 2008 onwards. Between 2008 and the early, probably 2012, 2013, Ireland went into a fairly major economic recession that ultimately led to what we refer to as the emergence of the Troika. The Irish economy effectively has to be bailed out by the International Monetary Fund, the European Union and the European Central Bank. So Ireland went into a major period of recession. The knock-on effect of this was job losses, but the knock-on effect of job losses meant that fewer people were going on the road to travel up to Dublin to work. So the knock-on effect of the recession was that emission levels in different sectors of the Irish economy declined rapidly in 2008, 2009 and 2010. The driver of this reduction in emission levels wasn't actually government policy as such, it was the impacts of the recession. The carbon tax was finally introduced in the 2009 budget. Now, obviously, the Greens, when they came into government, one of the things they said they wanted to see being brought in was a carbon tax. And basically, Fianna Fáil agreed to that when they made their kind of agreement for going into government in 2007. The carbon tax was brought in 2009 with the expectation that the level would increase in for future budgets. Now, why were Fianna Fáil more amenable to bringing in the carbon tax in 2009? Well, obviously in 2009 the government was desperate. In this recessionary period, the government was desperate for any measure that would bring in more government revenue. So the carbon tax was a form of extra government revenue. The carbon tax as well, looking at the politics of this, the carbon tax was also something that you could blame on the Green Party. You could kind of give a nod and a wink to the public and saying, yeah, okay, we know you're not happy about this carbon tax, this extra taxation on top of other things. But, you know, sorry guys, we're in government, Greens, the Greens want this brought in and we have to do it. It's not our fault, don't blame us. This is a Green Party policy initiative and we've got to do this because we've gone into coalition with them. So, as it happened, Ireland actually achieved that 13% target by 2010, mainly because of the impacts of the recession. So far, so good. Now, the European Union was moving on. The European Union was saying, look, to its member states, look, okay, we've achieved our Kyoto Protocol targets. We're going to probably see a new agreement being put in place at the 2009 Global Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, the annual CO COP conference of parties. Said, look, we're leading up to this 2009 conference in Copenhagen. There'll probably be a successor treaty being decided at this Copenhagen conference. And we, as a body, the European Union needs to be ready for even more ambitious targets. And Ireland was going, yeah, guys, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, love that environment, yeah. And they said, okay, we will expect the most economically advanced countries within the European Union to sign up for the most significant emission reduction targets. And Ireland was going, that's great, yeah. That includes Germany, the most, at that point in time, in the mid-2000s, they were looking at the most affluent countries. So Luxembourg, we're looking at you. Germany, we're looking at you. Sweden. Hang on, which country has the highest level of economic growth? Which country has the highest levels of economic affluence in the European Union at the moment? Oh yeah, you, Ireland, yeah. You're going to have to sign up for significant emission reduction targets next time around. And Ireland went, well, you what? So the EU was now pushing for more ambitious new emission reduction targets. And the idea of the EU 2020 targets was that the most economically advanced or most economically affluent countries would be expected to reduce their emission levels. So this was also happening in the background. That, okay, we may have by accident reached our burden sharing agreement targets, but these were targets that allowed us to still increase our greenhouse gas emissions. The next time the next new targets we're going to be trying to reach are going to be targets that require us to reduce our greenhouse gas emission levels. Now, the Greens, as a member of that government, and that government really was quite an unlucky government, well, especially the Greens go into that government because most of that government's time was taken up with the knock-on effects of the big economic recession that came in from 2008 onwards. But the Greens were also trying to bring in environmental change as part of this, and basically wanted to bring in a new climate change bill. Now, the problem with the Greens were they were a party with 6 TDs. Fianna Fáil, at the start of this government, was a party with 77 TDs. So the Greens were very much the junior party in this government. There were still a few PDs left around that were also included in this government. So the Greens knew in 2007 that if Fianna Fáil, if they fell out with Fianna Fáil and said, look, if they kind of made a climate change bill a major sticking point in 2007, Fianna Fáil could just look at the Greens and say, okay guys, you want to leave government, that's entirely okay with us. We might find a few independents and we'll get enough TDs to form a government. So in 2007, Fianna Fáil liked the idea of having the Greens in government, but they didn't necessarily need the Greens in government. So the ability of the Greens, the kind of political influence of the Greens in government in 2007 and early 2008 wasn't particularly very strong. They were just a small party of 6 TDs in a government with a very large Fianna Fáil party that had 77 TDs. However, the changing politics of this period actually started to help the Greens increase their levels of influence in the government. Because as the recession went on, a number of Fianna Fáil TDs started to lose faith, started to lose confidence, and started to realise, actually, if I'm still a member of Fianna Fáil come the next general election, I might lose my seat. So a number of Fianna Fáil TDs started to leave the party. So the numbers came as time went on. The one thing that could be said in fairness of the Greens in this period was that their TDs, their 6 TDs, kind of held fairly steadfast. Now, most of them probably expected they were going to lose their seats at the next general election, but Green TDs, Green Party politicians generally don't tend to be as they tend to have a more philosophical attitude to losing their seats than members of other parties. The Green TDs were thinking, okay, if we stay in this government, we're going to have a lot more clout, a lot more influence as time goes on. And come 2010, 2009 or 2010, we'll have enough clout to actually get a climate change bill over the line, because by that stage, Fianna Fáil will know either keep us in government or there's no government. The government will collapse. So by the years 2009, 2010, the Greens had reached the point where they were absolutely vital for the continuation of the government. If the Greens left the government in 2010, the government would fall. Now, there's a graph just showing you what happened in terms of emission levels. So you can see where the big growth occurred with emission levels. Look at the trend in terms of transport emission levels. The big sector in terms of accounting for greenhouse gas emissions is the agriculture sector. That's the line at the top of the graph, the green trend line there. The big growth in emission levels during the Celtic Tiger period, energy and transport. But you can start to see what happens in 2008, 2009. You can start to see how emission levels from those sectors tailed off quite a bit. In fairness, energy emission target, the emission levels from energy started to tail off from the year 2000 onwards. Probably as you start to see more renewable sources of energy entering the Irish market. But you can see that dip in emission levels from transport from 2008 onwards, and that's the knock-on effect of the recession. And that does have an impact in terms of decreasing Ireland's overall greenhouse gas emission levels, just enough to reach that 13% EU burden sharing target. And there's the overall growth levels in emissions. The green line there is Ireland's emission levels in 1990. So you can see from around the mid-1990s onwards, you start to see a very significant growth in emission levels right up until the early 2000s. And levels more or less stay around that level right up until 2008. And then you have that dip in 2008. And it just falls underneath the red line. The red line there is that the level associated with a 13% increase in emission levels relative to the green line, relative to 1990 levels. So as I said, a lot of things was happening with government. By the years 2009, 2010, the Green Party's, the level of influence held by the Green Party in the government increased quite a lot. A number of Fianna Fáil TDs had upped and left. The Progressive Democrats were no more. Mary Harney was still a member of the government. The other member of the Progressive Democrats, Noel Grealish, it was actually Kieran Cannon. The other member of the Progressive Democrats, Kieran Cannon, had more or less upped and left the government. So the government was, Fianna Fáil especially, they were starting to lose TDs, sometimes one a month or that. By 2009-2010, when the two parties sat down to renew the agreement for government, at that point in time, the Greens had a lot more clout, and they decided they were going to use the clout. And the one thing the Greens wanted to bring in before they left power, and the Greens were pragmatic enough to know this government probably wasn't going to last the full 5 years because of the knock-on effects of the recession. So the Greens realised, okay, we want to bring in a climate bill, and we need to bring it in soon enough because otherwise this government's going to run out of time. And the amount of time that the government had left was significantly reduced by the fact that in November 2010, you had the economic bailout by the Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union and European Central Bank, effectively meaning that for a number of years, the Irish government effectively would have to follow the financial advice of these other. Effectively, Ireland would lose its economic independence for a number of years. And in the wake of that, there was a general expectation that this government would only have a few months left. Fianna Fáil were hoping that the government would last maybe until the summer of 2011. And so they were quite willing to kind of go with any suggestions the Greens might want. They really wanted to keep the Greens on board. So when the Greens put forward the idea that they wanted a new climate change bill being brought in, Fianna Fáil, the then Taoiseach Brian Cowan was, okay, yep, fair enough, we'll go with that. So the general hope within Fianna Fáil was if the Greens were allowed their climate change bill, they were allowed to bring in their climate change bill, that would keep them on board as a member of the government until the summer of 2011, at which stage, hopefully, maybe the economy would be starting to pick up a bit. And Fianna Fáil were expecting to lose seats, but they were kind of hoping that if we could get to summer 2011, maybe our support levels might increase a little bit to save maybe a couple more seats. Now, just highlighting the fact that the Greens were, by the end of 2010, the Greens themselves realised they were rapidly running out of time. The climate change bill, or the climate change response bill, was published literally 2 days before Christmas. So you can literally see just the levels of pressure that the Greens felt they were under just to get this bill over the line. So they brought in the bill in 2 days before Christmas in 2010. They allowed, as with all bills, they allowed a period for public consultation, but they kind of reduced the period for public consultation. There was basically, they said there'll be a month for public consultation. The bill was greeted by a number of environmental groups. Oisin Coughlan, director of Friends of the Earth, said, "It's a great day for supporters who worked so hard over the last few years for Ireland to play its full part in the fight against climate change." The big hope of the Greens was they would get this bill over the line, they'd get this bill passed into law before the end of the spring. So they knew they were on borrowed time. They knew this government really wasn't going to last any longer than maybe May or June or July of 2011. But the big hope was if they could just kind of fast track the bill through the Seanad and the Dáil, they could get this bill over the line. They could get this bill passed into law by maybe March or April of 2011. And then they'd probably be, at that stage, then they'd probably consider leaving government at that stage. So just to show the pressure the Greens felt, how the Greens really felt they were trying to get this bill done in as short a period of time as possible. As I said, the bill came in, was published 2 days before Christmas. So you can imagine the Minister for Environment, John Gormley, was literally working on this literally up to Christmas Day. Normally bills are introduced in the Dáil, but this time the Greens decided we'll introduce this in the Seanad because Otherwise, we're going to have to wait a few days to get this. So the Greens were doing their absolute, politically, they're trying to do their utmost to get this bill passed through the Dáil as quickly as possible. And it takes a while for a bill to get passed through the Oireachtas. You have to have a debate on what they call the first stage debate of the bill. That has to take place in the Dáil and Shannon. There's usually, the bill then has to be sent to a particular committee, maybe the Committee on the Environment. Then you have a second stage debate, and there's sometimes going to be amendments to the bill that have to be debated as well. So it can take a while for a bill to be passed into law, to be moved through the Oireachtas, the Dáil and the Shannon. Surprise, surprise, there was opposition to the bill. And where did the opposition come from? The opposition came from, again, the business lobby and the farmers' lobby, but there was also opposition within Fianna Fáil. There was opposition from Fianna Fáil backbenchers and Fianna Fáil senators. And this was probably the most significant opposition, because once you moved into January 2011, the Greens started to look at the numbers and said, hang on a second, a number of Fianna Fáil backbench TDs have said they're not going to vote in favour of this bill. They'd prefer to leave Fianna Fáil rather than vote in favour of this bill. So eventually, once you hit January of 2011, the Greens, a few weeks after this bill was introduced, the Greens realised, actually, you know what? We're probably not going to get this bill passed into law, because a number of Fianna Fáil TDs are now, or a number of Fianna Fáil senators will vote against this bill, and we won't have the numbers to pass this bill. Now, you might have said, oh, what about the opposition? Because the opposition was saying, we're saying a lot of nice things about the environment at that point in time. Would the opposition support the bill? No, they wouldn't, because the opposition would be hoping, okay, if this bill doesn't get passed, we're going to have an early general election and happy days. Opposition from IBEC. IBEC said, look, this bill, if it's passed into law, they said, look, we're looking at this bill. They said, some of the targets mentioned in this bill are crazy. They said, look, the European Union is setting very ambitious emission reduction targets already for Ireland, but this climate change bill being proposed by the Greens is even talking about even Ireland trying to achieve even higher targets. Our economy's in a recession. We're basically fighting for survival here. And if we add on these extra costs that's suggested by this climate change bill, it's going to be hugely damaging to our economic competitiveness. They said, look, the government is signalling much higher environmental penalties than anywhere else in Western Europe. Climate change, they said, is a long-term global problem that will not be solved by Ireland going it alone. Interesting take. Think back to collective action problems, everyone. Oh, why should we be the one country to take all this action? So again, this kind of collective argument you get in relation to collective action problems. Like, why should Ireland take the lead here? Why should Ireland be the one country taking these ambitious measures? And what happens if every country's going down that line? Well, you can nearly guess what happens. Nothing gets done. So the other concern for the business lobby, they were saying, okay, when Kyoto was brought in, when we signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, when we signed up to the EU Burden Sharing Agreement, we were in a European Union that was made up of 16 member states, most of which were Western European countries, were affluent Western European countries. They also said, hang on a second now, the European Union in 2010 is very different to the European Union in 1997. We now have 27 or 28 member states. Most of the new member states are Eastern European countries that have much lower levels have lower economic standards than the rest of Europe. And these Eastern European countries, IBEC were saying, look, what's going to happen with this new EU burden sharing agreement? The Eastern European countries, because they're economically developing, they're going to be allowed the same leeway to increase emissions that Ireland was allowed in the mid-1990s. So they said, we're going to have to compete with firms from Poland, with firms from Bulgaria, with firms from Romania, that won't have any environmental taxes imposed on them. These countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, they probably will be allowed to still continue increasing their emission levels. So already, even in terms of what we're signing up to as part of the European Union, already we're going to be at a comparative disadvantage or a competitive disadvantage with firms in Eastern European countries. So why are we adding on this extra dimension? Why are we adding on even more burdens on Irish businesses? The farmers' lobby also opposed the proposed climate change response bill. They said, look, it's adding extra costs on farmers, it's going to impact adversely on Irish agriculture. And they also said, well, you know what? Why should Irish agriculture have to suffer? Why should Irish agriculture have to suffer? They said, you know, what's the best thing to happen? They said the best thing that happen would be that Irish agriculture produces more because we're more sustainable. Maybe other countries around the world should be doing less in relation to agriculture. Said, what's the main problem with agriculture, with the impacts of agriculture on climate change globally? They said, it's what's happening in the Amazon rainforest. It's what's happening in Brazil. They said, what the hell? Like, why are we going to saddle ourselves with all these restrictions when the real cause in terms of agriculture, the real cause of global environmental damage is what's happening in Brazil and other parts of the world. It's not what they say. The issue globally isn't what Ireland's doing because we're pretty sustainable by global standards. They said the issue is what's being done in other parts of the world, most notably the deforestation in the Amazon rainforest to create beef ranches. They said that's not sustainable. That's crazy. They said the obvious solution would be, look, let's focus on parts of the world where agriculture is sustainable and maybe try and find measures to discourage people in the Amazon from people in Brazil from kind of chopping down the Amazon for all these beef ranches, these beef farms, which really just aren't, they're not as environmentally sustainable as the beef farming we have in Ireland. So you had, as I have shown there, opposition to this climate change bill from the farmers' lobby, from the business lobby. The public as well were fairly open to the ideas being put forward by these lobbies in late 2010, early 2011. The public at this stage were terrified about the state of the Irish economy. And when the business lobby is saying, look, if this bill comes in, it's going to have really bad effects on the Irish economy, the public quickly bought in with these. In rural areas, the public quickly bought in with the ideas being put forward by the farmers' lobby. The farmers' lobby would also be saying, look, what the Greens are trying to do is it's anti-rural, it's anti-farmer. They say, look, this is, and the Greens at that point in time were very much viewed as a middle-class urban. So that there would also have been this rural Ireland argument put forward saying, look, this is middle-class urban politicians who don't understand rural Ireland, who are trying to put the major burden of the costs of climate change onto rural people. And look, this is an urban-rural thing. Many politicians start to respond to this opposition. Opposition party members in the Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture said, look, we need to halt this. We need to put this climate change response bill on hold. We're going too fast on this. We need to stop the process and think a bit more about this and maybe review the bill. But Fianna Fáil members of the Oireachtas Committee were also saying the same thing. So the Green Party started to read the tea leaves. The Green Party started to see the way the land was lying. They started to realise very quickly in January 2011 that this bill was not going to happen. They'd drawn up the bill, but the bill would just remain a draft bill. Bills will always just remain draft bills until they are passed through the national parliament, until they are debated and that bill is passed through the national parliament. In this case of Ireland, passed through the Oireachtas, the Dáil, Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann. So the Greens quickly realised in January 2011, actually, you know what, Fianna Fáil, even though Brian Cowan, the Taoiseach, the leader of Fianna Fáil, is saying they'll support the bill, a number of his party members are just going to undercut this. And the opposition isn't going to help us out here. They're not going to support this bill either. This bill, let's face it, guys, we tried our best, we ran out of time, this bill is not going to happen. And eventually, after a number of more internal controversies within Fianna Fáil in January 2011, eventually the Greens said, look, let's give up the ghost. And the Greens pulled out of government in January 2011 and the government collapsed. There were a number of lessons to be learned for the Green Party. One of the major lessons was don't leave things so late. If you want to get a climate change bill passed into law, you need to try and get it done as soon as you go into government. You don't want to leave it until effectively last minute because you will run out of time. The different lobby groups will organise themselves and they'll put pressure on politicians, and that bill just won't happen. So the Greens learned a lot of lessons from the first period in government, and they put these into effect when the party returned to government the next time after the 2020 general election. So what happened in 2010? Yeah, this is more or less what I said already. I won't go through this again. I more or less made this point on the previous slide, so you can read this yourself. So, as I said, the big hope Fianna Fáil had, just to recap again, the Fianna Fáil leadership in 2010, early 2011, initially looked as if they were going to support the Greens, they were going to back the climate change response bill. But not every member of the party, backbench TDs, senators, a number of them came out and said, look, we're going to vote against this bill, even if it means we're kicked out of Fianna Fáil, we lose the party whip, we have to run as independents in the next election. Oh no, that'd be terrible. A lot of them were hoping to run as independents, I'll be honest, in 2011. It quickly became obvious that Fianna Fáil weren't going to, all the members of Fianna Fáil weren't going to be supporting this bill. In January 2011, there was a lot of craziness going on in Irish politics, which became known as Golfgate. There was an attempt to remove Brian Cowan as Taoiseach. That failed, but then Brian Cowan made a few missteps when appointing new government ministers, and eventually another heave against Brian Cowan led to him resigning as party leader. And ultimately, with all the craziness happening within Fianna Fáil, with the growing recognition that they just wouldn't have the numbers to get the bill over the line, the Green Party decided, look, unfortunately, we're not going to get this bill over the line. This bill is not going to happen. The Greens decided to pull out of government on the 23rd of January 2011. Okay, the next time the Greens went into government, so after leaving government in 2011, the Greens lost all their Dáil seats in the 2011 general election. And I might have mentioned this in the earlier section. Their support levels nationally fell to 1.8%. They had been around, they had got support levels around 4% at the previous general election. So they lost all their seats. Support levels fell to 1.8% of the national vote, which meant the party hadn't enough support nationally to get funding, to get political funding. To get state funding for political parties in Ireland, a party has to win at least 2% of the national vote. So the Greens went into a period they went into a very bad spot. They'd lost all their seats. They'd lost most of their council seats in the 2009 local elections. They were down to just 3 councillors, basically county councillors, by the year 2011. The party was only really kept going as such by the new party leader, Eamon Ryan, more or less operating, doing a lot of voluntary work for the party. The party was basically operating on a shoestring between 2011 and 2016. In the 2016 general election, 2014 local elections, 2016 general elections, there was a slight improvement. The Greens won 2 seats in the 2016 general election, to won around 12 seats in the 2014 council elections. So there was a sense that the Greens, there was a slight increase in fortunes for the Greens, but not a dramatic increase. The big change for the Greens was what happened in 29, the climate strikes of 29. Once again, climate change, as happened in the early 1990s, as happened in 2006, early 2007, climate change once again was propelled back to the top of the political agenda. And in Ireland 2019, the economy is doing well. Once again, the economy was doing much better. The economy was fairly strong. So the public were quite open to the idea that, yeah, we should be taking more action on climate change. The knock-on effect of this growing focus or interest in climate change was that the Greens actually went on to have an amazing set of elections. First of all, the Greens went from 12 council seats up to 49 council seats at the local elections in 2019, and they won 2 seats in the European Parliament. And then in the general election, the Greens, so that was a record level of council seats for the Greens. The general election took place a few months later. The climate change issue had probably dropped a little bit, but not too much. And the Greens, to be honest, were also helped by the fact that Sinn Féin ran too few candidates. So the Greens were picking up surplus votes from Sinn Féin as well. The Greens went from 2 seats in Dáil Éireann to 12 seats in Dáil Éireann. And they also ended up with 5 members of Seanad Éireann. So all of a sudden, the Greens were now, they were still a smallish party, but they were now very clearly the 4th largest party in Ireland. And they were a party with 12 seats, whereas in 2007 they had only 6 seats. And Fianna Fáil were no longer the big beast they were in 2007. Back in 2007, Fianna Fáil would be winning 70-something seats. The number of seats would be in the high 70s. Fine Gael would be winning around 50 seats. After the general election of 2020, Fianna Fáil had just 37 seats, Fine Gael had just 34 seats. So the government, when the Greens decided to go back into government after the 2020 general election, they're now going into government with a lot more seats than they had ever won beforehand. But they weren't going into government with one very large party. They were going into government now effectively with 2 medium-sized parties. If you compare, say, to Fianna Fáil in 2007. Fianna Fáil didn't have the same clout in government in 2020 that they had in 2007. Fine Gael didn't have the same clout in government that they had, say, maybe back in 2011. So the Greens, in deciding to go into government with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the Greens were going into that government, first of all, with a lot more clout because the proportion of seats the Greens held within the government was much larger than they had in 2007. But the Greens also had learned from their experience going into government in 2007. They'd learned lessons. They learned, one of the lessons they learned was that if you want to get things done, if you want to bring in new bills, new laws, get them done as soon as you can. Don't leave things until the last minute because otherwise you'll run out of time. The other thing they learned was, as well as making changes to laws, you also should be making changes to the structure of the government itself. So you can make changes in terms of bringing in new laws, but you can also make changes in terms of bringing in new posts, kind of bringing in new posts in relation to climate change, bringing in people who will still be able to affect climate change policy if the Greens were to leave government. So the party, as I said, they learned their lessons from going into government. They got a climate change bill over the line in their first year in government, what became known as the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill. And this effectively, for some strange reason, sorry guys, the text has just been cut off the slides there, but basically what this did, it more or less said Ireland would be legally bound to try and halve its greenhouse gas emission levels by the year 2030 and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But as I said, the other things the Greens did in government was to put in place an infrastructure within government itself, within the civil service, within the government advisory bodies, that would be able to continue the fight against climate change, even if the Greens did leave government. And the Greens generally are pragmatic enough to know that usually they'll get one term in government and then they'll probably lose a lot of seats in the next general election. So Eamon Ryan there, a big long quote there, he says on what the Greens did. This was a big long quote from Eamon Ryan in 2023 on what the Greens were doing in government. Basically, the underlying part is, he says, in almost everything we are doing in this government, we are taking climate action. So generally, the Greens would sense that the level of success they had in government between 2020 and 2024, the level of success they had in government was definitely much higher than what they achieved in the period between 2007 and 2011. You did have COVID as a distraction, but by and large, the Greens did feel that they achieved a lot more during this period. Admittedly, even though you had that economic shock associated with COVID, admittedly, the economic conditions that they were operating under were much stronger than they were facing when they were in government in 2007, between 2007 and 2011. They didn't have to deal with a serious economic recession. The economy was doing better, and generally, people were maybe a bit more open to the idea that things needed to be done in relation to climate change, even though the ardor, the enthusiasm people felt about climate change has started to drop once again relative to that peak in interest in climate change that you had seen with the climate change strikes in 2019. So, the Green Party in government. June 2024 council elections. The Greens didn't have a great set of elections. They lost their 2 seats in the European Parliament in the European elections. In the council elections, their number of seats went from 49 down to 23. Now that seems bad, but it wasn't as bad a set of results as they had in the 2009 local elections. So there was a sense, okay, it wasn't a great election for the Greens, but they always expected to lose seats, and it hadn't been a total calamity. They still had roughly half the council seats that they had won in 5 years previously. And they had some very good results in the council elections in some parts of the country, such as Cabrera-Glasnevin, where they topped the poll. And looking at the council elections, there was a sense, okay, we're going to lose seats at the next general election. That was the sense amongst the party and the sense amongst most election experts. The sense they're going to lose seats, but they might hold on to 4 or 5 seats based on these results. However, when the general election came along, the Greens had a much worse election than they would have expected based on the local election results. So the Greens came into the election with 12 seats in the Dáil. They lost nearly all those seats. They just held 1 seat in the Dáil, and that was the seat of the new party leader, Roderick O'Gorman, in Dublin West. And if you think back to the European election section, Roderick O'Gorman's seat was more or less helped by the fact that Dublin West gained a 5th seat ahead of that election. So if Dublin West had remained as a 4-seater, Roderick O'Gorman would probably have lost his seat as well, and the Greens would have ended up with no seats in Dáil Éireann, as happened in the 2011 general election. So Roderick O'Gorman remained as the one Green Party TD after the election, but the Green Party won about 3% of the vote, so they didn't end up. Green Party support didn't fall to such a level that we're losing state funding. So it still won enough votes to maintain state funding. Obviously, with just 1 seat, they were out of government after the election. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael had a pretty good election. They gained seats. Uh, Generally, what you find with the junior partner in coalition governments is generally they do a lot worse than the bigger parties in that coalition government. They're usually often viewed as the mudguard. Why did they do so badly? Maybe there were reactions against Green Party policy. As I said, there was a lot of enthusiasm about climate change in 2019. The enthusiasm had sort of dipped a lot by 2021, 2022. A lot of people weren't too happy with aspects of the Green Party's policy. The carbon tax wasn't a particularly popular policy. A lot of people felt that the carbon tax was particularly disadvantaging certain groups over other groups in society. Rural people felt the carbon tax was impacting more on them than people in urban areas. So rural people are saying, oh, it's okay for people living in the cities. They've got buses, they've got luces. We have to travel to work, and a lot of us are traveling to work in Dublin. And unless a lot of us really have to drive to work. Otherwise, we've got a 3-hour bus and train and bus and train. We'll have to kind of go all over the shop to get to work. So there was a sense that the Green Party policy, the Green Party's environment policy, was impacting adversely on a lot of people, but certain sectors of society felt they were suffering more than others. And there was a particular rural-urban divide here. Now, the Greens have always done better in urban areas. What was interesting about the 2020 election was that the Greens actually didn't do too badly in rural constituencies. Now, most of their seats in 2020 had been won in urban constituencies, but the Greens picked up seats in Waterford, and like Waterford would be a largely rural constituency, and they picked up a seat in. So they picked up some seats in they picked up a seat in Wicklow as well, which also has a very large rural. The Wicklow constituency, you do have Bray and Greystones, but there's still a very large rural part to that constituency. So you were seeing a rural-urban dimension at play here. Since leaving government, there's a general sense that the Greens have probably moved a bit more to the left of the political spectrum. So the Green Party, under the leadership of Eamon Ryan, was quite a pragmatic party, very much viewed as a centre-left party, but a centre-left party that was willing to go into government to do business. The Greens party under Eamon Ryan was basically a party that felt the best way to get things done is to be inside the tent rather than outside the tent. The best way to get things done is to go into government and actually get policies brought in. The Green Party, since leaving government, have moved a lot more to the left of the political spectrum. You see them starting to align themselves more with the other left-wing parties, including the other centre-left parties like Labour and the Social Democrats. And Labour and the Social Democrats were the parties that probably gained the most from the Green Party losing seats, but also aligning themselves more with the more harder left parties like People Before Profit and Solidarity and also Sinn Féin. So there might be a sense that maybe the Greens are kind of moving a bit more to the left of the political spectrum, and that might shape their policy approaches over the next 10, 15 years. Maybe the Greens mightn't be as willing to go into government with, say, Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil or both of them the next time the opportunity arises, the next time they have a good election and they win a significant number of seats in the Dáil. Finally, just these graphs there, just to show you, this might be interesting. This shows you the sectoral breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions within Ireland in 1990 and 2003. So you can see the areas where you've seen the big increases in emission growths, particularly. The ones to look at there, agriculture is always a large sector, but the big increase in terms of emission growth levels, I mentioned this already, you can see, compare the numbers for transport in 1990 with the numbers for transport in 2003. Now, you're younger, you can see the numbers there, but you can see the share, the pie chart there, the share accounted for by transport, the yellow segment there, that just rapidly increases between those periods. So transport as a contributor to greenhouse gas Ireland's greenhouse gas levels, transport has become a more significant contributor. Agriculture remains very strong. There's been a reduction in some other areas like energy. Energy has dropped quite a bit, in part because maybe energy producers have worked out how to be a little bit cleaner in terms of energy production, in terms of kind of if you're using fossil fuels. But the other key driver here is the fact that you're starting to see a lot more renewable sources being used for electricity production literally over the last 10 years in particular. Anyway, that's actually a very long recorded lecture today to cover two lectures for the coming week. But hopefully it helps you make sense of what's been happening in terms of not just climate change policy in Ireland over the last few decades, but also general environmental policy in Ireland over the last few decades. So I'll leave it there.